Alrighty, we'll go ahead and get going. We are continuing a series called 12 Dead Guys That You Should Know. If any of you guys would throw up our PowerPoint. We are covering a guy today. He will have passed away in the 19th century, so we are rapidly approaching our conclusion date, and so we're going to look at James Hudson Taylor today. My guess is that you've probably never heard of Hudson Taylor. I think you're going to appreciate his story. Much of his life aligns with priorities that we have as a church, that I think the church has. He is one of the first that we've covered that is a pretty much strictly missionary. He spent most of his life going back and forth between England and China. And so we're going to look at Hudson Taylor. Again, I've given you this quote every week, and I think the more I think about it, the more important it becomes. Mark mentioned it, briefly on Sunday. We have to be careful not to read the present back into the past. And I think the more you dig into history, the more you appreciate the necessity of understanding this principle. And it really, again, it applies much broader than just biblical, spiritual history. I was listening today to a podcast talking about World War II and listening to some of basically the same idea. There's a historian by the name of Sarah Payne who is actually a professor at the Naval Academy and was talking about why certain things happened in the war and this and that, and basically made the point that, we as Americans view history as very reactionary to the degree that, why did certain things happen because of our involvement in it? And, but much of the rest of the world doesn't view it that way, right? And doesn't strategize that way, and for better or worse. But got to be careful not to read the present back into the past, and history has to be understood in its own time. And again, we're looking at that on Sunday morning, looking in the Corinthian church, right? There are nuances there that are unique to them, right? And it's not that we can't understand that, but if we try to force and push our own, modern assumptions back on that context, we're going to, at best, we're going to see it incorrectly. At worst, we're going to take something that's completely not intended there. So let me tell you a little story. And I want to hear your stories too. So these are the mountains of Honduras, north of Tegucigalpa, which is the capital. You fly into there. This was my first taste of international mission work, working with an organization called Mission Lazarus 10, 15 years ago. Went up into the mountains and helped plant churches there and did on-the-job training and things like that. Think with me for a second. What has been your experience with mission work? Where have you been? What have you done? I know if we got our entire group together, Gold Hill Road has went a lot of places. I know individuals have went places. Where have we all been? Robert?
I've been bitten by 3 dogs.
Say what?
I've been bitten by 3 dogs.
Been bitten by 3 dogs. Okay.
When I grew up in.
Okay.
That's kind of mission work.
Yeah. And hold to that, because we're going to come back to that. So, local to where Robert grew up. Where else? Kenya. Okay, Kenya. We've supported various works in Haiti for a long time. Where else?
Guyana, South America.
Okay, Guyana, South America. Very. Kenya, in Africa. In your eyes, what defines effective missionary efforts? How would you define it? If somebody came and put a gun to your head and said, what's the litmus test? What's the, whether this was worth the effort or not? What makes a good missions effort worth it?
The response of the people.
Okay, the response of the people. What else?
That the work continues in that area without your presence.
Huge one, Harry. If you couldn't hear Harry. Does the work continue without your presence or involvement, right? Another one that comes up often is our financial support, right? Can we get a work to become self-sufficient so that, the way I always love to describe it is the bus principle, right? You walk out the door, you get hit by a bus. Does the work continue if you're not here to do it? Right, Mark?
Add on to that, that's one of the reasons we as a congregation have historically tried to support preacher training schools
Yep.
in the native area that we're supporting. So
Yeah.
instead of sending a bunch of American white missionaries
Yep.
into Haiti or Kenya, we tend to support the local preaching schools.
All right, I'm gonna put you on the spot because this works perfectly. Why? Why do we do that as opposed to just funneling money? Why is local people doing the work there? Why does that usually work better?
Well, there's a number of different reasons, but one reason is there often becomes something of a financial dependence on the visiting missionary. Mm-hmm. And so we want to make sure that they don't start off with, well, as long as the missionary here, everything's going great. I mean, we'll reference Corinthians again, Paul leaves after being there 18 months and it feels like things go south.
Yep.
Same thing. And also, we want them to be able to speak in not only the native culture, but the native tongue, but the native culture.
Yeah.
And so, a Haitian missionary or a Haitian resident
Yeah.
is going to be much more familiar with the people and the culture and the country that he's preaching to
Yep.
than an Anglo-American missionary from Arkansas.
Right. So this is going to work perfectly to touch on Hudson Taylor, because Hudson Taylor, again, is going to die right at the turn of the century, but is heard as a young man about China being primarily untouched by the gospel at this point. Again, this is late 1800s. And so he went and made it his life's mission to go and live and start, but he did it in a way that was really unusual at the time, which was he learned Mandarin before he went over there. When he went over there, most of the organization that he started, we'll touch on that in a minute, really wouldn't take a lot of financial support. Now that came back to bite them at some point, but it was admirable on paper, because the idea was we don't want to have such a backlog of money that's going to dictate how and why and what we do. We believe God will provide, right? And so not only was there a insistence that you have to know the language, you have to go and be amongst the people. This is not a 1 week, 2 week thing. This was, you're going to come stay for years at a time. And it was interesting, I called and talked briefly to David Langley, who many of you know was the minister at Seneca, met his wife Yaning in China. He was a missionary there teaching English at a college there. And now again, Hudson Taylor is going to come out of the Methodist Church. There's a lot theologically that we don't agree with, but there are still missionaries there that are doing good work, according to David, from this time period. Again, well over 100 years later, because of the buy-in, right? And seeing the authenticity there. I found this quote, and I thought this was great. And this is going to touch on Robert's thought here in a minute. Domestic mission work is not the lesser task of the church. I want you to just process this for a second. Because again, today this is probably our most missions evangelistic focused of our 12. Domestic mission, local mission work is not the lesser task of the church. It is the proving ground of our obedience. If the gospel does not move us to reach those in our towns, it'll never move us to reach those beyond them. I hope we believe that. I feel very confident that Gold Hill Road as a church embodies this. Again, 10 of us are going tomorrow to Texas to really fulfill that same thing. Now, granted, we're not going to preach necessarily, but we're going to enact and to show the love of Christ in an area that may or may not have ever seen it. And again, we're just going to help. I want you to think about this, because we're going to come back to this, because again, now Hudson Taylor is going to spend most of his life going back and forth to China. But later in his life is going to really push and prioritize, once the Chinese missions really gets up and going, is going to kind of push and say, what are we doing in our own backyard, right? We got this thing going here. We got a model to work off of. What are we doing here? And I think still to some degree, many of us probably struggle when we think of mission work. I bet 98% of us immediately go to somewhere outside of our borders, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. But I want you to think about what work is there in our backyard, right? And we'll touch on that more in a moment. Again, how do we define effective mission work? We'll come back to that because he's going to give us a definition here in a bit. All right, so this is kind of the introductory material, and then we'll look at it kind of theologically as we've done. 1832, is born in Barnsley, England. Again, was raised in a Methodist home, studied medicine professionally before he went over into China, but also began to study Mandarin. And again, much of, if the question's like, why does he care about China? Anecdotally, the story that is still told is that he heard a traveling speaker that came through London at some point in his teenage years that described the Far East, right? Because again, remember, travel is more accessible by that point, but most people have not gone that far yet. So I mean, it was, and we'll look at it. His initial journey over to China really resembled much of Paul's. I mean, he literally was shipwrecked. He eventually will lose his wife. He will lose 4 of his 8 children. I mean, he loses a lot to pursue this. But he learns Mandarin before he ever heads over that direction. And I want us to think about this because we see this a lot. If you've been here on Sunday nights, we've been studying David in 1st and 2nd Samuel. And I think we see partials of this. God often shapes the people that he will utilize long before the mission becomes public, right? And that is Hudson Taylor's kind of story, right? Private devotion precedes public mission. And we see that in his life, right? He doesn't go over to China until he's in his 20s. And then spends the rest of his life doing that. David, right, doesn't become king until probably sometime in his 30s, but has formative years leading up to that develops into some of the characteristics that's going to make him a really good king. So again, kind of 3 outline, and then we'll kind of break off into each one. So journey to China at 21, he's going to set sail with the Chinese Evangelical Society. They're going to be shipwrecked. They're going to get sick. Once he gets there, right, culture and loneliness is going to really step in. We'll touch on the other 2 here in a minute because he's going to adapt to Chinese culture. But I want you to look at just the journey to get there, right? Again, think about mission work. I know many of you have went places, and that's fantastic. But I want you to think about, what are we willing to do to spread the gospel? What are we willing to do? If you heard, and again, this church is tremendous about when we hear of a need. For the most part, we drop what we have to and go help when we can. If somebody came to you and said, there's a part of the world that is completely unchurched, that has not heard the gospel at all, here's an opportunity for you to go, would you do it? And I know that's a big ask, and that is not for many of us. We'll never have that opportunity, but I want us to go through the exercise. Would you consider it if it was placed before you? That is Hudson Taylor's legacy. All right, so September of 1853, he's going to set sail on the Dumfries, again, under the Chinese Evangelical Society. But his decision was shocking to many, right? Because he's young, he's not married, he's venturing into one of, at the time, it was considered to be one of the most closed and dangerous nations in the world. But he hears that they've never had the gospel, and so he decides to go. The voyage itself starts out, it's almost 6 months long, right, to get from England to China. Early on, they almost run aground off the coast of Wales. Later on, they get a little closer to, at the time is known as New Guinea. They get caught in a super violent storm that comes really close to destroying their entire ship. Right, they finally get into Shanghai in March of 1854. If you know anything about the Taipei Revolution that was happening at that time, right, that was still tumultuous. That was civil war that was happening, literally killed millions of Chinese. That was still, outsiders were viewed as dangerous in many ways. It was in ruins, disease was rampant, and foreigners were considered dangerous. Right, so he himself was isolated. It was disorganized. It was underfunded. Right, he had very little financial support of his own. He was sick, he was lonely, and he was unfamiliar with the climate, the language, the culture. So it brings the question up, and again, we'll talk more about this in depth in a moment, but are we willing to lay aside comfort, reputation, all the nuance that comes with modern life to reach others for Christ? That is to say, how far are we willing to go? And the reality is that most of us will never have this asked of us. But it still begs the question, are we willing to consider it? How far are we willing to go? I think it begs the question, what does the Great Commission truly mean to us, right? Think about this. Again, we'll come back to this in a moment. All right, by 1965, nearly all missionaries were concentrated in China's coastal cities, right? Almost nobody was in the interior. So Taylor's going to find what's going to become known as CIM, China Inland Mission, that up until the communist revolution that happened in China, where everybody was kicked out that wasn't native Chinese, and that was especially true of religious groups. So eventually, CIM is going to get kicked out of China and have to relocate to Singapore, but there's still the remnants of this organization is still around that wants to bring the gospel to inland China. And he wrote in his journal, and many of his journals are still widely available. You can Google them and look at all the PDFs of them. If I had 1,000 lives, China would have them all. And again, it's not that he's got, any particular connection to this place other than the gospel's not there. And again, this is going to sound like a broken record, but when we have demographics in our lives of people that fit this same bill, we don't have a particular connection other than they don't know Jesus. But we act like, to be involved, it has to check all these boxes. Again, I'm overgeneralizing, but for many of us to get involved in a work, it's like, well, what's my connection to it? Is it financially, viable? Do I have the time? Do I have this? Do I have this? It has to fit like 9 different categories for us to even consider being a part of it. And Hudson Taylor looked at this, well over 100 years ago and said, they don't know the gospel. That's it. I'm going to go be involved, right? If I had 1,000 lives, China would have them all. So here's where some of his radical principles that I want us to consider. And we'll look at how they align to Scripture here in a minute. Missionaries were called to live by faith, not by guaranteed salaries. Again, that was a principle that held all the way until they were kicked out of China, was they didn't take formal money in many cases. They believed that they would be provided for, and for the most part, they were. Now, there are times where they suffered some because of that, but by and large, they always had their needs met, right? They were to adopt Chinese dress and customs, again, accept what was contrary to Scripture. Men and women were encouraged to serve equally in the field, right? And so by Taylor's death in 1905, CIM had over 800 missionaries in every province of China. When he got there not that long ago, there were almost none. I mean, at that time, there were almost 0 missionaries anywhere. There were most anecdotal evidence of people that had never even heard the name Jesus, much less know anything about him. And then again, in a relatively short amount of time, you go from nothing to hundreds of missionaries that are all throughout, China. So personal suffering, right? Chronic illness. Again, 4 of his 8 children are going to die. His wife Maria is going to pass away. Mob violence is going to destroy much of the missionary property in 1868. But Taylor's going to refuse to retaliate. He's going to refuse to leave. In fact, he is going to go on to help in many ways, help rebuild after some of these. But we want to look scripturally. Again, this is where we've kind of always tried to push into. So if anybody's got their Bibles, I'd like us to open up here. So we see in 3 places: Philippians chapter 4, Matthew chapter 6, and I'm sure there's something good in 2 Corinthians, but I don't remember where that is. So we'll say Philippians 4 and Matthew 6. But one of the main principles that he had was absolute dependence on God's providence. He believed profoundly in the concept of living by faith, trusting God to supply all the needs without direct fundraising or appeals for money. He viewed dependence on God's promises as central to both personal holiness and the work that he would participate in. Now, again, we could say right at the top, there is absolutely nothing wrong with pulling support when we're going and doing mission efforts like this. But it's interesting to, again, as an exercise, do we have enough confidence to believe that these needs will be met? Philippians 4 and verse 19. Somebody will read that aloud.
God will supply every need of yours according to his riches and glory in Jesus Christ.
God will provide every need according to his purpose, his riches. Now, what is the rub in that verse? What does almost every one of us struggle with this? Again, this is a promise, again, and we have to balance this with God's not a genie. God has never promised to fulfill every single need. This is a little more broadly talking about here, but what do we struggle with regards to that? Harry, would you read it one more time?
And my God will supply every need of yours according to his riches and glory in Jesus Christ.
Matt.
If you really internalize that, that means we're letting go on control.
Yeah.
And you know, we want to have control in every aspect of our lives.
Yep.
And some things we don't deem as a big deal because it's assumed in society, such as working
Yeah.
for, a wage.
Right.
But if we give that up too, now suddenly we have control of nothing.
Yeah. So Matt brought up the very word that was central in my mind, control. That is what 99% of us are going to struggle with regards to the providence of God and how God works in our life. And again, when we need God, we have very little struggle handing things over, right? When a sickness comes our way, when a family member's hurt, right? God, you take the reins. You take control, whatever you deem necessary. But in every other facet, Matt brought up work. That's a great one. Anytime where our money and our job and the prestige and the all the things that may come with that, right? We feel like we naturally deserve a say in how that, all aligns. But then it somehow has to still reconcile with, I will provide. My God will provide all things according to his riches. And that's the rub of that, right? That is the will of God that sees a plan that we often are unfamiliar with. All right, Matt.
You said just there. I think that's also why Abraham was viewed as righteous. In the surface, you're like, oh, go.
Right.
And okay, he went, but
Yeah.
But he left everything.
Everything.
And he gave everything God. I mean, he didn't have a job.
Yeah.
He didn't have his family.
Right.
It says, leave your father's house.
Yeah.
So he left everything to the unknown. And then 4,000 years ago, that was probably very, very scary. It's scary for us today, but it was especially scary then.
Yeah. If you couldn't hear Matt, I mean, Abraham, so many things that come to mind when you think of him, but his willingness to give it all up is tremendous. I mean, it's hard. I think it's really hard for us, certainly in our modern context, to contextualize what that would be like, to say, God, you take everything, right? You take, again, job, you take family, you take money, you take plan, you take shelter, you take it all, and you guide me where you would have me to go. All right, Matthew chapter 6 and verse 33. Would somebody read that aloud for us?
But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you.
Seek first the kingdom. Again, that's very much, right, wrong, or otherwise, that's kind of where he lived his life of, all the money, all the provisions, all the physical things will fall in place. But at the head of everything, it has to be seeking the kingdom, right? Specifically to people that don't yet know that. So here at the bottom, I wrote the principle: God's work in God's way will never lack God's supply. I read that way, and I thought, again, we could put all the asterisks of this. God's not a genie. I'm not saying that every single thing that we're never going to be unsure or that we're, never going to want for something, but the truth is when it is part of God's plan. And I think that may be the greatest contingency of all of this, is when it is the will of God to be done. And we don't always know that. We just have to concede that sometimes. And I'm as bad as any about struggling with, where do we draw that line? How do we break all that apart? But God's work done in God's way, that is to say, part of God's plan, will never lack God's supply. Mark.
I think you were going for 2 Corinthians 9, 9, and 10.
That sounds right. Read that.
As it is written, he has dispersed abroad, he has given to the poor, his righteousness endures forever. Now may he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food supply and multiply the seed you have sown and increase the fruits of your righteousness.
That's absolutely it. Again, that concept of how God will provide, how God will give the increase, right? When it is part of God's way, when it's part of God's plan, then, God's portion is there, right? And that's tough enough for us to say, if we truly embodied this in our current context, with all the things we, our jobs and home and everything, as all the comforts of life. But imagine going, again, it would take, now granted, we could fly there much quicker, but it took him 6 months to travel that far away from home and then still to embody this principle, to say, Lord, now granted, he had studied Mandarin, so he was somewhat familiar with the language, but culturally it was new. He didn't have any family there. He was there purely to preach. But Philippians 4, Matthew 6, 2 Corinthians 9, all point us to the idea that, again, if it's God's work done in God's way, then God's supply will be there. And again, not to say that he didn't struggle. He's going to lose quite a bit. But he did, most of his life was spent in mission work, and most of the needs were always met. Dependence on God's providence. What he described as presence ministry. 1 Corinthians 9 and verse 22, if somebody will turn there. And John chapter 1 and verse 14. It's interesting because, again, remember the time period when this is in. So again, late 1800s, mid to late 1800s for most of this. And the mission work, as we know it, was still somewhat of a foreign concept. Now remember back 2 or 3 dead guys, right? People are going to start sending missionary preachers to America. But that was a much different prospect in the sense that they were coming over here to settle. Yeah, there was a spiritual implication. Yeah, they were going to preach. But in many of those cases, they wanted to come to try to get a better life. It wasn't about, hey, there were people here that didn't necessarily know the gospel. Now, there was some of that, right? They came over to preach to some of the Native Americans and things like that. But little different context. Here, Hudson Taylor is going to he's going to go live much of his life in China, but then he still has family back in England and things like this. But he's going to call it presence ministry. Again, adopt Chinese dress, learn the language fluently, live among the people rather than apart. At the time, it was revolutionary. What we wanted to do, again, my disclaimer for us is don't take our modern context and force it back on antiquity. There's probably a branch of that principle that, when we talk about mission work, of we try to take our modern church context in terms of logistics and look and sound, and we're not talking theologically, but just all the X's and O's of how we do church, and then we take it over to Kenya, or we take it to Haiti, or we take it to wherever, and we wonder why it doesn't work, because it's not the same, right? And it's not better or worse, it's just culturally different. At the time, it was still and there's still principles of that now where we try to take our current stuff and take it into other places. And he kind of flipped it on its head and said, that's not going to work, right? We got to live with these people. There's buy-in that has to take place. If we're just coming in for a week at a time and trying to shove, white Protestant Christianity down their throats, they're never going to care. But if we come in and live here and speak their language and eat their food and our kids go to school together and we worship together, it's still going to be an uphill battle, but at least there's buy-in that they know that we care, right? We're here for the long haul. And there's still principles of this that are still very much alive and well in modern mission work. Again, he believed missionaries should identify with the culture if they wanted to reach them. All right, 1 Corinthians 9 and verse 22. Somebody read that aloud for us.
To the weak I become weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some.
Now we're pretty close to getting into this on Sunday morning, so we won't dig too deep into this, but this is, read it one more time, Todd.
To the weak I have become weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some.
By all means I might save some. Because again, remember, and Mark's done a tremendous job guiding us through this on Sunday morning. The church in Corinth, their big issue is division, right? Because, to some, who baptized you matters. To some, who your parents are matters. To some, what country you're from matters. To some, what profession you have matters. Circumcision matters. It's all these weird, and so Paul's going to come in and say, listen, to this group, I'm going to become like this group. To this group, I'm going to become like here. He's not talking, he's going to wishy-washy theologically, but he's saying culturally, I am going to adhere to this. And if it means that I get to go and live in the lives of these people, that's how I'm going to get to share the gospel, right? That I might get to save a few. Yeah, Matt.
It's also kind of, one of the things Mark said 3 weeks ago, I think, but this point around, isn't it better to be defrauded than to take your brother to court?
Yeah.
And it's a continuous theme of, like you said, division, and given different examples. And last week we talked about having liberty to eat food, it's just food.
Yeah.
But if it causes a brother sin in chapter 8, we shouldn't do it.
Yeah.
And so I think that's all just about our liberties, right?
Yeah.
So this guy, he could have stayed in England.
Yeah.
It was his liberty.
Right.
But he's sacrificing the things that he wants for the furtherance of the gospel.
Yeah.
And it's just so hard to do, to the point, and obviously, it's easy to reflect on how little I've done that myself.
Yeah.
And so I like what you're saying.
Well, I appreciate it. Honestly, this is one of those where, again, we're getting a little more modern, so maybe that has something to do with it. But, my toes felt a little stepped on this way. Myself, again, to Matt's point, you've got folks that this is not ancient history. We're not thousands of years ago anymore. I mean, this guy is still very much in what we would consider to be modern history, who made a choice and say, I'm gonna set it all aside to go after and spread the gospel to folks that didn't have it. And again, to go back to recite Paul here, 1 Corinthians 9, to the weak I've become weak that I might win the weak. I've become all things to all people that by all means I might save some. I love, Matt used the phrase liberty. And that, I think that is a big theme in 1 Corinthians to the Corinthians because they struggled with that. But we see it here in mission works as well of, are we willing to let go of our liberties, the things that we feel entitled for, so that we may save some? Hudson Taylor would say it's absolutely worth it. John 1 and verse 14.
The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. Glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth.
The Word became flesh. Hudson Taylor saw the Word as having the power to change lives. What's interesting is at the time of his death, again, this is well over 100 years ago, The low estimation is somewhere in the 100 to 150,000 folks have come to know Christ. Now again, this is theologically, you're not going to agree with everything Hudson Taylor says, although in most anecdotal evidence says that he taught baptism as a necessary part of salvation. But again, broadly speaking, 100,000 folks heard the gospel. Right? Now, again, we have multiple mission efforts that is aiming just to get the gospel in front of people, right? And there's some value in that. The higher estimations say that it might be north of 1 million to 2 million people that just in his lifetime, so that's stopping at about 1905, heard the gospel because of efforts that he participated in, because he believed that the gospel had the power to change lives. Right? Do we still believe that? I think we do, right? That we can take the gospel to areas even in our own backyard, right? To go to schools, to go into people's homes that may not know the gospel yet and say, look what it has done for me, right? But equally, if it needs to go to Texas, we'll take it to Texas. If it needs to go to Kenya, we'll take it to Kenya. If it needs to go to Ethiopia, we'll take it there, because that's what we've been called to do. The gospel became believable when lived out in humility and identification with those being reached. Again, he viewed it as the gospel became more teachable when there was buy-in by those that he was teaching, right? And I'd suggest to you as a gospel preacher, that's still very much true. Now, he did it in a missions context, but there's a very real principle of buy-in, right? And you've heard this, that, people don't care what you know until they know that you care. I mean, friend, I cannot, I know that sounds cliche. I know, somebody probably made that up however many years ago, but it is so true. Mark.
That's exactly the point. That he didn't do all of this and travel and sacrifice and all that because he didn't care for humanity.
Yeah.
There's a part of spreading the gospel is because you love your fellow man as much as you love God. And obviously, if you don't love your fellow man, you're lying about loving God.
Yeah.
So, you don't do this without some kind of love for your fellow man.
Yeah, you can't. I mean, and at maybe best, it's going to come across as fake and ineffective. At worst, it's hypocritical, right? You can't preach the gospel without loving the people around you. You just can't do it. And again, that was his principle, is the gospel becomes more believable when it is lived out, right? When people are looking across the dinner table, right? And again, I don't want this to ever come across as like anti-mission groups, because again, there's value in going for a week, 2 weeks, however long. I think next year our young people are going to do a domestic trip to go to Biola Battery and help and do that very same thing. But there's a whole nother level when you're doing that, but you're living it out. And you've heard me say this, you are uniquely qualified to preach to somebody. Again, I could come into your neighborhood, into your school, into your work environment. There may be people ripe for the study, but they don't know me. They don't know me from Adam. They don't know my story. They don't know anything. They don't give a rip about what I have to say because we don't have that. The same way that Hudson Taylor says these indigenous Chinese folks, they don't, it's going to take time for me to build a rapport and then let me preach. In the same way that you probably have an opportunity to go and preach and teach to somebody that isn't going to listen to me, isn't going to listen to Mark, isn't going to listen to Robert, but they may listen to you. Because seeing the gospel lived out is easily the most effective way to preach it, bar none. And again, that's coming from somebody that preaches it for a living. And I'm telling you, living it out is the greatest sermon ever told. And he saw it that way. The centrality of prayer. So let's go to Matthew 7 and then James chapter 5. I know we're running close on time, so we may have to rush through these. But he maintained that prayer was the engine of the mission. And I love that phraseology. He said, prayer is the engine of the mission. It's not just a supplement, right? Move man through God by prayer alone, right? His entire missions policy essentially relied on prayer for finances, for protection, for workers. Matthew 7 and verse 7.
Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be open to you.
Friends, prayer has got to be a central part of our lives, right? Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened. James chapter 5, verse 16.
Confess your trespasses to one another and pray for one another that you may be healed. The effective, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much.
The effective prayer of a righteous man is capable of doing tremendous things. There's a lot more we could say about that. For the time, we're going to move on. The advance of the gospel depends not just on human effort, right? And again, you and I, this is the parable of the sower personified, right? You and I have an important responsibility in this, but a relatively small part in the sense that we spread the seed, right? But the power of God released through prayer, the power of God to enact change in people's lives, right? We believe that is one of the central roles that the Spirit is involved in, both to us and to others, right? Prayer has got to be a central part of this, and he very much believed that. Faith in God's sovereignty and guidance. Again, we'll kind of brush through this quickly, but he believed that God was sovereign. And you may remember this last week. Charles Spurgeon talked a lot about the sovereignty of God. In fact, a great many of our 12 Dead guys really hone in on the sovereignty of God. And that's probably not unusual given the time that they lived in, right? They very much lived in a time of kings and monarchs and things that, when the Catholic Church was ruling and then the Church of England and then all these, different folks that had real power over their lives. I think it kind of circles back to that may be true, and we do have some responsibility to that, but God is truly king, right? And he very much viewed it that way. Even in crisis, right, he saw God's hand directing, right? And again, the sovereignty of God and the providence of God very much go hand in hand in the same discussions. He always talked about them almost interchangeably. Maybe even more so than I would be comfortable with, but they are in some ways two sides of the coin, right? Obedience to God's will, even when costly, is the pathway to blessing. Now, he would talk about that at length, about spiritual blessing and fruitfulness, right? Faith in God's sovereignty and guidance. The urgency of evangelism. And again, this is one that aligns perfectly with, I think, the mission of the church and the mission of this congregation, right? Every believer shares responsibility for evangelism towards the entire world, right? Let's read real quickly Matthew 28, 18 through 20, and then Romans 10, 14 and 15.
Jesus came and said to him, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Friends, that's not a bonus category that if we get around to it, great. That is an everyday driver responsibility of every one of us. If we put on Christ, if we want the name Christian and the title Christian, then one of the responsibilities that comes with that is spreading the good news, right? That is part of why we're here. We talk often about we want to get to heaven and bring as many with us as we can. Romans 10, 14 and 15.
How then will they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe on him of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? And how are they to preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who have preached the good news.
Preaching the good news is central to the life of the Christian. Again, we'll move through this quickly. Holiness and obedience, we've touched on this already. God uses clean vessels, right? He talked often about the missionary success would come with personal righteousness. That doesn't mean perfection, but it does mean pursuing the life of Christ. And I think there's a lot to this. He hit on a lot of good things here of we are better when we pursue Christ. That's just a broad statement that we could really drill down into a lot of different things. But broadly speaking, we are better when we pursue Christ. And he's going to say that especially when you're out on a limb like he was almost his entire adult life, yeah, being holy in God's eyes matters. And he's going to take that really to heart. 12 Dead Guys You Should Know. Hudson Taylor, again, really should be motivating to each and every one of us to pursue those around us. Maybe not as far as China, but those that may be right down the road from us. Next week, I'll be gone, but Matt Guy has graciously agreed to fill in, so he's going to actually go back in time a little bit. We're going to cover Alexander Campbell. A lot of really good stuff there, and then we'll be back at it. We only have, I think, 2 weeks left, so only a couple guys left to go. But any closing thoughts or questions before we wrap up? Yes, Barry.
I received a message on Sunday from a preacher in Kenya.
Okay.
And he said that since OTR became a mission to Kenya, that they have 31 congregations.
Wow. 31 congregations just since Barry and Sandra had been involved in Kenya. And again, we could spend the rest of the next hour and hours after that looking all around the globe where the gospel has been preached and it flourishes, right? Don't be surprised when you hear stories like this, but recognize that we have a spot in that plan. All right, thank you guys. I appreciate it, and we'll be back at it next week.